Marcus wiped down the glass counter of his small electronics repair shop for the third time that morning. The October sun filtered through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the cluttered workspace where old phones, tablets, and computers waited for his skilled hands to bring them back to life. The bell above the door chimed softly as a gentle breeze pushed it open slightly, but no customers entered. At 42, Marcus had grown comfortable with the quiet rhythm of his days. After 12 years of military service that had taken him to 3 different war zones, the peaceful monotony of civilian life felt like a luxury he never took for granted. His customers knew him as the quiet guy who could fix anything electronic, but they didn't know about the Purple Heart hidden in his desk drawer or the scars that crisscrossed his back from shrapnel that nearly killed him in Afghanistan. The morning had started like any other. Marcus arrived at 7:30, unlocked the metal security gate, and flipped on the lights that illuminated his modest kingdom of broken gadgets. His shop sat on the corner of 5th and Morrison, sandwiched between a laundromat and a small grocery store that had seen better days. The neighborhood wasn't fancy, but it was honest working-class people who appreciated fair prices and quality work. He had just finished replacing the screen on an elderly woman's tablet when he heard footsteps approaching his door. Through the window, he could see 2 young men walking with purpose toward his shop. Something about their movement made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It was the same instinct that had kept him alive during his tours overseas, the ability to sense danger before it fully revealed itself. The first young man was tall and thin, wearing a black hoodie despite the warm weather. His companion was shorter but stockier, with nervous energy that showed in the way he kept looking over his shoulder. Marcus had learned to read body language during his military training, and everything about these 2 screamed trouble. Their eyes darted back and forth, scanning for witnesses or escape routes, and they moved with the jerky, unpredictable motions of people high on something stronger than coffee. Marcus quietly reached under his counter and pressed the silent alarm button that connected directly to the police station. It was a precaution he had installed after opening the shop, though he had never needed to use it before. The button made no sound, but he knew it would alert the authorities that something was wrong at his location. The bell above his door chimed as the 2 men entered, but this time the sound seemed ominous rather than welcoming. The taller one immediately moved to his left, positioning himself near the wall of shelves that displayed phone cases and accessories. The shorter one stayed near the door, his hand buried deep in the pocket of his baggy jeans in a way that made Marcus's military training kick into high gear. "Can I help you gentlemen with something?" Marcus asked, his voice calm and steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his veins. He kept his hands visible on the counter, a non-threatening posture that nonetheless allowed him quick access to the baseball bat he kept underneath for emergencies. The taller one spoke first, his voice shaky with what Marcus recognized as the effects of methamphetamine. "Yeah, man, we need you to open that cash register real quick, like." His words slurred slightly and his pupils were dilated even in the bright light of the shop. "We don't want no trouble, just the money." Marcus had been in countless dangerous situations during his military service, from roadside bombs to direct enemy fire. But something about facing danger in his own peaceful space felt different. This was supposed to be his sanctuary, the place where he had rebuilt his life after the chaos of war. The violation felt personal in a way that battlefield encounters never had. "Listen, guys," Marcus said, his training telling him to stay calm and look for opportunities. "I don't keep much cash in the register. Maybe $20 or $30. You'd probably make more money returning bottles for deposit." He was buying time, hoping the silent alarm would bring help, while also genuinely trying to talk them out of whatever they were planning. The shorter one near the door grew more agitated at Marcus's response. "Don't try to play us, old man," he said, finally revealing what Marcus had suspected was in his pocket. The gun was small and cheap-looking, probably a .22 caliber pistol that had seen better days. But Marcus knew that even a small gun could kill just as effectively as a military rifle. "Open the register now or we're going to have problems." Marcus looked at the weapon and felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He had stared down the barrels of AK-47s, survived mortar attacks, and pulled wounded comrades to safety under enemy fire. This rusty little pistol in the hands of a scared kid high on drugs was certainly dangerous. But it didn't carry the same terror it might have for someone who had never faced real combat. "Okay," Marcus said slowly, raising his hand slightly to show compliance. "I'll open it for you. No problems here." But as he moved toward the register, his mind was already working through the tactical situation. 2 suspects, 1 weapon visible, unknown if the second man was also armed, limited space, multiple potential cover positions, and civilians potentially nearby in the adjacent businesses. The electronic beeping of the register opening seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence of the shop. Marcus pulled out the small stack of bills and placed them on the counter, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Like I said, it's not much. Maybe $28. The taller suspect grabbed the money and stuffed it into his pocket, but instead of leaving, both men lingered. Marcus recognized the look in their eyes, the way they were scanning his shop with increased interest. They were thinking about what else they might take, getting bolder as the robbery progressed without consequence. This was often when situations escalated from bad to deadly. "What about all this stuff?" the shorter one asked, waving his gun toward the shelves of electronics. "Some of this has got to be worth something." Marcus realized that what had started as a simple cash grab was evolving into something more complicated and potentially more dangerous for everyone involved. The atmosphere in the small shop grew thick with tension as the 2 robbers began eyeing the electronics with growing greed. Marcus watched them carefully, noting how their initial nervousness was being replaced by a dangerous confidence. The shorter one with the gun was becoming more animated, gesturing wildly as he spoke to his partner about which items they should take. "Look at all these phones, man," the taller suspect said, moving closer to the display case where Marcus kept refurbished smartphones. "These got to be worth hundreds." His voice carried the manic energy of someone whose judgment was severely impaired by drugs, making him unpredictable and potentially violent. Marcus knew from his military experience that situations like this could spiral out of control quickly. When criminals started expanding their original plan, it usually meant they were getting desperate or high enough to take bigger risks. Either way, it made them more dangerous to everyone around them. "Those phones don't work," Marcus lied smoothly, hoping to discourage them from staying longer. "They're just shells I use for parts. No batteries, no circuits. Worth maybe $5 each for scrap." He kept his voice steady and matter-of-fact, the same tone he had used when briefing nervous soldiers before dangerous missions. The shorter robber wasn't buying it. He stepped closer to Marcus, waving the gun in an erratic pattern that made the shop owner's military instincts scream warnings. "You think we're stupid?" he demanded, his voice rising to an almost hysterical pitch. "These are smartphones. They're worth good money." Marcus realized he was dealing with someone whose grip on reality was tenuous at best. The combination of drugs and adrenaline was making the young man increasingly volatile, and the presence of the weapon made every moment potentially deadly. He had seen similar behavior in combat zones, where fear and substances could turn ordinary people into extremely dangerous threats. "You're right," Marcus said, switching tactics and agreeing with the gunman to de-escalate the situation. "I was just trying to protect my merchandise. Take whatever you want." But even as he spoke, his eyes were calculating distances and angles, preparing for the possibility that he might need to act to protect himself. The taller robber had moved behind the counter now, invading Marcus's workspace and making the shop owner feel even more cornered. This suspect seemed slightly more rational than his armed partner, but that didn't make him less dangerous. He was methodically going through drawers and looking for anything valuable he could quickly grab and carry. "Where's your safe?" the taller one demanded, apparently assuming that any business would have a secure place to store valuable items. "Don't tell me you don't have one, because every shop like this has got a safe somewhere." Marcus didn't have a safe. His business was small and relied mostly on daily cash flow, rather than keeping valuable inventory or large amounts of money on the premises. But he realized that telling these men the truth might make them angry enough to do something violent out of frustration. "I don't keep a safe here," Marcus said honestly. "This isn't that kind of business. Most of my work is repair services, not retail sales." He gestured toward the workbench where several partially disassembled devices lay waiting for his attention. "I make my money fixing things, not selling expensive new equipment." The explanation seemed to agitate both robbers further. They had clearly expected to find more money or valuable merchandise than Marcus's modest shop contained. The reality of their small haul was setting in, and Marcus could see them becoming more desperate and therefore more unpredictable. "This is bull," the shorter one said, his voice climbing toward panic. "We came here for money and you're telling me you got nothing?" He pointed the gun directly at Marcus's chest, his hand shaking enough to make the weapon bob up and down in a way that terrified the shop owner, despite his military training. Marcus had been shot before, during his second tour in Afghanistan, and he still carried pieces of shrapnel in his left shoulder that set off metal detectors at airports. The memory of that burning sensation and the months of rehabilitation that followed made him acutely aware of how quickly a situation could go from bad to life-changing, or life-ending. "Look, guys," Marcus said, trying a different approach, "I understand you need money. We all got problems, but this isn't going to solve whatever situation you're dealing with." He spoke with the authority of someone who had seen real hardship and survived genuine life-or-death situations. $28 and some broken electronics isn't worth going to prison for armed robbery. The taller robber laughed, but it was a bitter sound without any real humor. "Prison? Man, we're already looking at prison time. Got warrants, got debts, got people looking for us." His admission revealed that these weren't just opportunistic criminals, but men who felt they had nothing left to lose, which made them exponentially more dangerous. Marcus's military training had taught him that cornered enemies were the most unpredictable and violent. When people believed they had no options left, they were capable of extreme actions that defied logic or self-preservation. The robbers were revealing themselves to be exactly that type of threat. "What about the register in the laundromat next door?" Marcus suggested, hoping to redirect their attention away from his shop and potentially give himself an opportunity to escape or call for help. "They probably have more cash than I do, especially this time of day when people are doing their weekly washing." The suggestion seemed to catch their interest, but instead of leaving to pursue this new target, they began discussing whether Marcus should come with them to help with future robberies. The conversation revealed that their criminal thinking was becoming more grandiose and dangerous as their drug-fueled confidence grew. "You know what?" the shorter one said, the gun still pointed in Marcus's direction. "Maybe we take you with us. You can talk to people. Make them feel safe before we tell them what's what." The proposal sent chills down Marcus's spine because it suggested they were planning to continue their crime spree and wanted him as some kind of accomplice or hostage. Marcus realized that the situation was moving beyond a simple robbery into something much more serious and dangerous. These men were no longer thinking about just taking his money and leaving. They were beginning to see him as either a useful tool for future crimes or a potential witness who could identify them later. Neither option boded well for his chances of walking out of this situation unharmed. The small electronics shop felt like it was shrinking around Marcus as the two robbers continued to debate their next move. The shorter one with the gun was pacing now, his movements jerky and unpredictable as the drugs in his system made him increasingly agitated. Every few seconds he would point the weapon at Marcus, then wave it around wildly while talking to his partner. "I'm telling you, we should take him with us," the gunman insisted, his voice rising with manic energy. "He looks like somebody people would trust. Clean-cut older guy. People won't see us coming if he's doing the talking." The criminal logic was disturbing in its calculated coldness, revealing that these weren't just desperate addicts but predators planning multiple crimes. Marcus kept his expression neutral, but his mind was racing through possibilities and potential responses. His military training had prepared him for being taken prisoner, though those scenarios had involved foreign enemies rather than domestic criminals. The principles remained the same: stay alert, look for opportunities, don't give up hope, and remember that captors often made mistakes that could be exploited. The taller robber was becoming more interested in his partner's suggestion. "So that could work," he said, nodding enthusiastically as he continued rifling through Marcus's workspace. "We hit a few more places today, then figure out what to do with him later." The casual way he discussed Marcus's fate, as if the shop owner wasn't standing right there listening, showed how completely they had dehumanized him in their minds. "I can't help you guys," Marcus said firmly, trying to assert some control over the situation. "I've got a business to run, customers expecting their repairs. People will notice if I'm not here." He was hoping to remind them that his disappearance would be noticed quickly, making their escape more difficult if they took him with them. The shorter robber laughed, a high-pitched sound that conveyed both amusement and menace. "You think we care about your customers? he asked, moving closer until the gun was only inches from Marcus's face. Your repair business is the least of your problems right now, old man. Marcus could smell the chemical odor on the gunman's breath, a combination of methamphetamine and poor dental hygiene that made him want to step back. But he held his ground, knowing that showing fear or weakness might encourage more aggressive behavior. In combat, he had learned that predators could sense vulnerability and often attacked when they detected it. Look, Marcus said, trying once more to reason with them. You got what you came for. The smart thing now is to leave before someone notices what's happening here. He gestured toward the windows that faced the street, where occasional pedestrians and cars passed by. Every minute you stay here increases the chance someone calls the police. The mention of police seemed to trigger something in the taller robber. The cops are already looking for us anyway, he said with bitter resignation. Got pulled over yesterday with some merchandise that didn't exactly belong to us. Had to run on foot. Left the car behind. This revelation explained their desperate state and why they felt they had nothing to lose. Marcus realized he was dealing with career criminals who were already facing serious charges. The knowledge that they were fugitives made them infinitely more dangerous because they had strong motivation to avoid capture at any cost. In their minds, adding more charges to their list probably didn't seem like a significant additional risk. Where's your car? The shorter one demanded suddenly, apparently making a decision about their next move. We need wheels, and walking around with you is going to look suspicious. The assumption that Marcus would be coming with them sent a chill down his spine, but he tried not to let his fear show. I don't drive to work, Marcus lied smoothly. I live just a few blocks away and walk here every morning. His truck was actually parked in the alley behind the shop, but he didn't want to give them any more resources to use in their crime spree. The last thing he wanted was to provide transportation that would make it easier for them to hurt other innocent people. The taller robber slammed his fist down on the counter in frustration. This is just getting better and better, he said sarcastically. No safe, no car, barely any cash. What kind of business is this? His anger was building, and Marcus recognized the signs of someone who was about to lash out violently when things didn't go according to plan. Marcus had seen the same pattern in combat zones, where frustrated enemies would sometimes turn their weapons on prisoners or civilians when military operations went wrong. The unpredictability of drug-impaired criminals made them even more volatile than trained soldiers, because they lacked the discipline and strategic thinking that might restrain their violent impulses. Maybe we should just cut our losses, the gunman said suddenly, but his tone suggested he was really asking his partner's opinion, rather than stating a firm decision. Take what we got and find somewhere else to hit. For a moment, Marcus felt a flicker of hope that they might actually leave without escalating the situation further, but the taller robber shook his head emphatically. No way. We came here for money and we're leaving with more than $28. He looked around the shop with calculating eyes, clearly trying to figure out how to extract more value from the situation. There's got to be something here worth taking. Marcus watched as the criminal began pulling electronic devices off the shelves, apparently planning to steal whatever looked valuable enough to fence later. The problem was that most of the items in his shop were either broken devices waiting for repair or used parts with limited resale value. The robbers' frustration was likely to grow as they realized how little their haul was actually worth. These tablets got to be worth something, the taller one said, grabbing several devices from a shelf near the window. Even if they're broken, somebody will buy them for parts. He was stuffing electronics into a plastic bag he had found behind the counter, creating evidence that would make their crimes much easier for police to prove. The shorter robber was becoming increasingly agitated as he watched his partner gather merchandise. This is taking too long, he complained, waving the gun in increasingly erratic patterns. Someone's going to see us and call the cops. We need to move now. His paranoia was justified, but it was also making him more dangerous as his stress level climbed. Marcus realized that the dynamic between the two criminals was becoming unstable. The gunman wanted to leave quickly, while his partner wanted to maximize their take from the robbery. This kind of disagreement between criminals often led to poor decision-making and increased violence as they tried to resolve their conflicting priorities under pressure. The tension in Marcus's shop reached a dangerous peak as the two robbers began arguing with each other about how to proceed. The shorter one with the gun was becoming increasingly paranoid, constantly looking toward the windows and jumping at every small sound from outside. His partner continued stuffing electronics into bags, seemingly oblivious to the growing risk of discovery. "We need to go right now," the gunman hissed, his voice tight with anxiety. "I saw someone walk by the window twice already. They're probably calling the cops." His grip on the weapon tightened, and Marcus noticed his finger moving closer to the trigger as his stress level climbed. The taller robber ignored his partner's concerns, continuing to grab items from the shelves with greedy determination. "Just give me another minute," he said dismissively. "This stuff is worth more than that pathetic cash register." He had found Marcus's collection of vintage electronics, items that actually did have some collector value, and was methodically adding them to his growing pile of stolen goods. Marcus recognized the classic pattern of criminal partnerships under stress. One partner was focused on the immediate danger of being caught, while the other was blinded by greed and opportunity. This kind of disagreement often led to violence, either between the criminals themselves or directed at their victims as they tried to resolve their conflict. "You're not listening to me," the shorter robber suddenly exploded, swinging the gun toward his partner in a moment of pure rage. For a terrifying second, Marcus thought he was about to witness one criminal shoot another right in his shop. The weapon wavered between the two robbers as the gunman's self-control began to completely unravel. The taller criminal finally stopped his looting and raised his hands in a placating gesture. Okay, calm down," he said, clearly recognizing that his partner was on the edge of doing something catastrophically stupid. "We'll leave in just a second. Let me grab one more bag of this stuff and then we're out of here." But the damage was done. The shorter robber's already fragile mental state had deteriorated to the point where he was now pointing the gun at anyone who disagreed with him, including his own accomplice. Marcus realized that the situation had moved far beyond a simple robbery into the realm of genuine life-or-death danger for everyone in the shop. "You know what?" the gunman said, his voice taking on an ominous calm that was somehow more frightening than his earlier panic. "Maybe we don't need to worry about being caught. Maybe we make sure there's nobody left to identify us." The implication was crystal clear, and Marcus felt his military training kick into high gear as he prepared for the possibility of imminent violence. Marcus had faced death before, but always in combat situations where he had weapons, training, and fellow soldiers to rely on. Being trapped in his own shop with two unstable criminals was a different kind of nightmare, one where his survival depended entirely on his ability to think quickly and act decisively when the opportunity presented itself. The taller robber seemed to finally understand the seriousness of what his partner was suggesting. "Whoa, hold up," he said, stepping closer to the gunman with his hand still raised. "We're not killers, man. We're just trying to get some money and get out of here. Nobody needs to get hurt." His words carried the tone of someone trying to talk a friend down from a dangerous cliff. "Why not?" the shorter one asked, and the casual way he posed the question sent ice through Marcus's veins. "We're already facing armed robbery charges. What's the difference if we add murder to the list?" The drugs and stress had clearly pushed him beyond rational thinking into a realm where human life had no value whatsoever. Marcus knew he had to act soon, before the situation deteriorated further. His military experience had taught him to recognize the signs when violence was about to erupt, and everything about the gunman's body language screamed that he was seconds away from pulling the trigger. The question was whether Marcus could create an opportunity to defend himself without getting shot in the process. "Look," Marcus said, trying to insert himself into the conversation before it escalated further. "You guys are obviously under a lot of pressure, but killing someone isn't going to solve any of your problems. It's just going to create bigger ones." He spoke with the authority of someone who had seen real violence and understood its consequences. The shorter robber laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Bigger problems? What could be bigger than spending the rest of our lives in prison?" He turned the gun back toward Marcus, and the shop owner could see his finger tightening on the trigger. "At least this way, we don't have to worry about witnesses." Marcus's military training had included extensive practice in disarming opponents, but those techniques had been designed for combat situations where he was armed and armored. Facing a drug-addled criminal with a gun in close quarters was a completely different challenge, one where the margin for error was essentially zero. The taller criminal was becoming increasingly alarmed by his partner's deteriorating mental state. "Listen to yourself," he pleaded. "You're talking crazy. We came here for money, not to hurt anybody. This old guy never did anything to us." He was trying to appeal to whatever remained of his accomplice's humanity, but Marcus could see that those efforts were failing. "This old guy is going to send us to prison for the rest of our lives," the gunman replied with chilling logic. "Unless he can't." The weapon was now pointed directly at Marcus's chest, held steady despite the robber's obvious drug impairment. At this range, even a poor marksman would have trouble missing a fatal shot. Marcus realized that talking was no longer going to resolve the situation. The shorter robber had moved beyond reason into a realm where violence seemed like the logical solution to his problems. If Marcus was going to survive the next few minutes, he would need to rely on his military training and hope that 12 years of combat experience had prepared him for this moment. The shop fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic outside. Marcus could feel his heart rate slowing as his combat training took over, flooding his system with focused calm rather than panic. He had been in countless situations where death was imminent, and survival had always depended on his ability to think clearly under extreme pressure. The gunman's finger moved to the trigger, and Marcus knew that the next few seconds would determine whether he lived or died. Everything came down to timing, distance, and the element of surprise that might give him one chance to turn the tables on his would-be killers. In the split second before the gunman's finger completed its deadly pressure on the trigger, Marcus's military training took complete control of his actions. Time seemed to slow as his combat instincts overrode 12 years of peaceful civilian life, transforming him from a quiet shop owner into the battle-hardened soldier he had once been. Marcus dropped low and lunged forward in one fluid motion, using a technique he had practiced thousands of times during his military service. His left hand swept up to deflect the gun barrel away from his body, while his right hand drove toward the gunman's wrist with crushing force. The move was executed with the precision of someone who had trained for exactly this scenario in environments where failure meant death. The gun discharged with a deafening crack that reverberated through the small shop, but the bullet went harmlessly into the ceiling, as Marcus's deflection sent the weapon off target. Plaster and dust rained down as the two men crashed into the display case, sending electronics scattering across the floor in a shower of broken glass and plastic. The shorter robber was completely unprepared for Marcus's explosive response. He had expected to face a terrified shop owner begging for his life, not a trained combat veteran who could disarm an opponent with lethal efficiency. The shock of encountering genuine resistance left him stunned and off balance as Marcus continued his assault. Marcus twisted the gunman's wrist with a sharp, practiced motion that forced him to release the weapon. The gun clattered across the floor, spinning under a workbench and out of immediate reach. But Marcus wasn't finished. His military training had taught him that half measures in combat situations usually led to death. So he followed through with devastating effectiveness. A powerful elbow strike to the gunman's solar plexus doubled him over. Gasping for air and unable to coordinate any kind of counterattack, Marcus grabbed the back of the robber's neck and drove his knee upward, connecting with the criminal's face in an impact that sent blood spattering across the shop floor. The shorter robber crumpled unconscious, his drug-fueled aggression no match for professional combat skills. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 10 seconds, but the transformation in Marcus was complete. The mild-mannered electronics repairman had disappeared, replaced by the soldier who had survived multiple tours in active combat zones. His movements were efficient and deadly, honed by years of training and real-world experience against enemies far more dangerous than these local criminals. The taller robber had watched his partner's destruction with growing horror, finally understanding that they had chosen the wrong target for their crime. This wasn't just some ordinary shop owner they could intimidate and rob. This was someone who had faced much worse threats than a couple of drug-addled thieves, and emerged victorious from encounters that would have killed lesser men. "Don't move," Marcus commanded, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. The remaining robber froze instantly, recognizing something in Marcus's tone that warned him he was now facing a predator rather than prey. The dynamic in the shop had shifted completely in a matter of seconds. Marcus reached under his counter and retrieved the baseball bat he kept for emergencies. but he held it with the casual confidence of someone who no longer needed weapons to control the situation. His mere presence had become intimidating enough to keep the remaining criminal in place. Too terrified to run and too smart to fight someone who had just destroyed his armed partner with bare hands. "Sit down on the floor," Marcus ordered, pointing to a spot near the wall where he could keep the robber under observation while dealing with the unconscious gunman. "Put your hands on top of your head and don't even think about moving." The commands were delivered in the same tone he had once used with captured enemies overseas, brooking no argument or hesitation. The taller robber complied immediately, sinking to the floor with his hands raised in surrender. He kept looking between Marcus and his unconscious partner, clearly trying to process how their simple robbery had turned into a nightmare, where they had become the victims instead of the perpetrators. Marcus retrieved the gun from under his workbench, checking to ensure it was still loaded while keeping one eye on his remaining prisoner. The weapon felt familiar in his hands, though it was a cheap piece compared to the military firearms he had carried during his service. He ejected the magazine and cleared the chamber, making the gun safe while retaining the ammunition as evidence. "My partner needs medical attention," the conscious robber said weakly, looking at the blood pooling around his unconscious accomplice's head. The irony of a criminal begging help for someone who had just been trying to commit murder wasn't lost on Marcus, but his military training included basic medical knowledge that he couldn't ignore even for enemies. Marcus knelt beside the unconscious gunman and checked his vital signs, finding a steady pulse despite the dramatic amount of blood. The injuries looked worse than they actually were, a common result of facial trauma, where even minor cuts could produce alarming amounts of bleeding. The robber would survive, though he would probably wake up with a severe headache and some lasting reminders of his poor career choices. "He'll live," Marcus said curtly, returning his attention to the conscious criminal, "though he's going to have some explaining to do when he wakes up in a jail cell." The sound of approaching sirens could be heard in the distance, indicating that his silent alarm had finally brought the cavalry he had been hoping for throughout the ordeal. The remaining robber seemed to deflate completely as the reality of his situation sank in. Not only had their robbery failed spectacularly, but they had also encountered someone who could have killed them both if he had chosen to do so. The knowledge that Marcus had shown restraint, rather than eliminating them entirely, seemed to weigh heavily on the criminal's mind. "Who are you?" the robber asked, his voice filled with genuine bewilderment. "Shop owners aren't supposed to fight like that. You moved like you knew exactly what you were doing." The question revealed his complete lack of understanding about the man he had tried to rob and potentially murder. Marcus looked down at the defeated criminal with something approaching pity. "Just someone who survived worse than you," he replied simply, offering no further explanation. The approaching sirens were getting louder, and he could see police cars beginning to turn onto his street through the shop's front windows. The unconscious gunman was beginning to stir, groaning softly as consciousness returned along with the pain from his injuries. Marcus kept the baseball bat ready and positioned himself where he could watch both criminals simultaneously. But the fight had gone out of them completely. They were no longer dangerous predators, but defeated men awaiting the consequences of their actions. The police sirens grew louder until they stopped directly outside Marcus's shop, followed by the slam of car doors and the sound of heavy footsteps approaching his front entrance. Through the window he could see at least 3 patrol cars and what appeared to be a supervisor's vehicle, their red and blue lights casting an eerie glow across the electronics displays. "Police! Anyone inside, respond!" came a commanding voice from outside, accompanied by the distinctive sound of officers taking defensive positions around the building. Marcus realized that from their perspective, they were responding to a silent alarm with no information about what they might find inside, making the situation potentially dangerous for everyone involved. "This is Marcus Chen, the shop owner," he called out loudly. "I've got 2 suspects detained inside. One is conscious and compliant. The other is injured but stable. I'm armed with their weapon, but I'm not a threat to officers." His military experience
had taught him the importance of clear
communication with responding law enforcement to avoid tragic misunderstandings. The first police officer through the door was a veteran sergeant whose experienced eyes quickly took in the scene. The broken glass, the blood on the floor, the unconscious man with obvious facial injuries, and Marcus standing calmly with a baseball bat in one hand and a disabled pistol in the other. It was clearly the aftermath of a violent confrontation, but determining exactly what had happened would require careful investigation. "Sir, I need you to place both items on the counter and step back with your hands visible," the sergeant said professionally, drawing his weapon but keeping it pointed downward. "We'll get this sorted out, but I need everyone to follow my instructions exactly." 2 more officers entered behind him, quickly moving to secure the conscious robber and check on his injured partner. Marcus complied immediately, setting down the bat and gun before stepping back with his hands raised. He understood that the officers had no way of knowing he was the victim rather than the perpetrator, and his calm cooperation would help establish his credibility as they investigated what had occurred in his shop. "Are you injured, sir?" one of the officers asked as he approached Marcus, visually checking for signs of trauma or blood. "Do you need medical attention?" The professional concern in his voice was reassuring, suggesting that the initial confusion about who was responsible for what was already being resolved. "I'm fine," Marcus replied honestly. "Bruised knuckles maybe, but nothing serious. The injured man tried to shoot me, but I was able to disarm him before he could follow through." He gestured toward the bullet hole in his ceiling as evidence of how close the situation had come to ending tragically. The conscious robber was already in handcuffs, sitting against the wall while an officer read him his rights. He kept staring at Marcus with a mixture of fear and disbelief, apparently still processing how completely their plan had backfired. The stolen merchandise was scattered around the shop, providing clear evidence of the attempted robbery. Paramedics arrived within minutes, quickly assessing the unconscious gunman's injuries and preparing him for transport to the hospital. The amount of blood made his condition look more serious than it actually was, but they took appropriate precautions while treating him. One of the EMTs commented that the injuries were consistent with hand-to-hand combat, rather than weapon trauma. "Can you walk me through what happened here?" the sergeant asked Marcus, pulling out a notebook to record his statement. "Start from the beginning and tell me everything you remember, even details that might not seem important." The officer's demeanor suggested he had already formed a preliminary opinion about who was responsible for what, but he needed a complete account for his report. Marcus provided a detailed chronological account of the robbery, from the moment the 2 men entered his shop until the police arrived. He described their escalating threats, the decision to take him as a hostage for future crimes, and the final moment when the shorter robber decided to eliminate him as a witness. His military background helped him recall events with the clarity and precision that law enforcement appreciated. "You mentioned military service," the sergeant noted, looking up from his notepad. "What branch and how long?" The question suggested he was trying to understand how a civilian shop owner had been able to disarm and disable an armed criminal without getting shot in the process. "Army, 12 years, Marcus replied. 3 combat deployments, special forces training. He didn't elaborate on the details of his service, but the information was enough to explain his capabilities to the investigating officers. I pressed the silent alarm as soon as they entered, but things escalated before help could arrive. The detective who arrived to take over the investigation was particularly interested in Marcus's account of the criminal's plan to take him hostage for future robberies. This revelation elevated the charges from simple armed robbery to kidnapping conspiracy, significantly increasing the penalties the suspects would face if convicted. "Did either of them mention other crimes they'd committed or planned to commit?" the detective asked, recognizing that this case might be connected to other unsolved robberies in the area. The taller robber's admission about running from police the previous day suggested they had been active for some time. Marcus repeated everything he could remember about the robbers' conversation, including their mention of outstanding warrants and their casual discussion of committing murder to avoid identification. The detective took careful notes, clearly building a comprehensive case that would ensure both men faced serious consequences for their actions. The forensics team arrived to photograph the scene and collect evidence, including the bullet lodged in Marcus's ceiling and the gun that had nearly ended his life. They also documented the blood evidence and took pictures of the broken display case where the struggle had occurred. Every detail would help prosecutors tell the complete story of what had happened. As the unconscious robber was loaded into an ambulance for transport to the hospital, he briefly regained consciousness and looked around in confusion. When his eyes focused on Marcus, he seemed to remember what had happened. and his expression shifted to something approaching terror before the paramedics sedated him for the journey to receive medical treatment. The conscious robber was placed in the back of a patrol car, still staring at Marcus through the window as if he couldn't believe what he had witnessed. His partner's destruction had been so swift and complete that he was probably still trying to process how their victim had transformed into their worst nightmare in a matter of seconds. You probably saved other people from becoming victims, the detective told Marcus as the IA scene was being cleared. These two were clearly planning to continue their crime spree, and someone else might not have been as fortunate as you were today. The comment helped put the violence in perspective, reminding Marcus that his actions had broader consequences beyond just his own survival. 3 hours after the last police car pulled away from his shop, Marcus found himself alone among the wreckage of what had been a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning. The afternoon sun slanted through his windows at a different angle now, illuminating the scattered electronics, broken glass, and dark stains on the floor that would serve as permanent reminders of how quickly life could change. He walked slowly through his shop, assessing the damage with the methodical approach he had learned during post-combat evaluations in the military. The bullet hole in his ceiling would need repair, the display case would have to be completely replaced, and several pieces of equipment had been damaged during the struggle. But he was alive, and that made everything else merely inconvenience rather than tragedy. The silence felt different now than it had that morning. Before the robbery, the quiet of his shop had been peaceful, a sanctuary from the chaos of his military years. Now it carried an edge of alertness, as if the violence had awakened instincts that had been dormant during his civilian life. He found himself automatically checking sight lines and exit routes, old habits reasserting themselves after years of dormancy. Marcus picked up his phone to call his insurance company, but hesitated as he realized he would have to explain what had happened. The story sounded almost unbelievable even to him. 2 armed robbers had entered his shop planning murder, and he had defeated them using skills he had hoped never to need again. Yet the evidence was all around him, making the incredible undeniably real. The local news had apparently gotten word of the incident, because his phone began ringing with calls from reporters wanting to interview the shop owner, who had fought off armed robbers. Marcus let them all go to voicemail, having no desire to relive the experience for public consumption or to be portrayed as some kind of action hero, when he had simply done what was necessary to survive. As he swept up broken glass, Marcus reflected on how completely his quiet civilian identity had been stripped away in those few crucial moments. For 12 years he had successfully buried the soldier inside himself, becoming genuinely comfortable with his role as a peaceful electronics repairman. But the military training had been there all along, waiting beneath the surface for the moment when survival depended on its resurrection. The detective called to update him on the suspect's conditions and charges. The unconscious robber had awakened in the hospital with a concussion, several broken teeth, and a newfound respect for the consequences of choosing victims poorly. His partner was already in jail, having confessed to multiple previous robberies in hopes of receiving a lighter sentence for cooperation. Turns out you were right about them planning more crimes, the detective told Marcus. They had a list of businesses they wanted to hit, including the elementary school down the street from you. Your actions probably prevented a lot of people from getting hurt. The information provided some satisfaction, confirming that the violence had served a greater purpose than just his personal survival. Marcus's neighbors began stopping by throughout the afternoon, having heard about the incident through the community grapevine that seemed to spread news faster than official media. Mrs. Patterson from the laundromat brought him coffee and insisted on helping clean up, while the grocery store owner offered to lend him security equipment until he could upgrade his own systems. "I always knew there was something different about you," Mrs. Patterson said as she swept debris into a dustpan. "You had that way of watching everything, like you were always ready for trouble. Now I understand why." Her observation reminded Marcus that his military bearing had never completely disappeared, even when he thought he was successfully playing the role of an ordinary civilian. As evening approached, Marcus made the decision to reopen his shop the following day, rather than taking time to recover from the trauma. He had learned during his military service that returning to normal routines as quickly as possible was often the best way to process violent experiences and prevent them from defining his future. The insurance adjuster, who arrived to assess the damage, was amazed by how minimal the destruction actually was, considering that an armed robbery and violent struggle had occurred in the small space. "Usually when we see this kind of incident, the damage is much more extensive," she said while photographing the bullet hole. "You must have kept your head during the whole thing." Marcus didn't bother explaining that keeping his head during violent encounters had been his profession for over a decade. Some experiences were too complex to convey to people who had never faced similar challenges, and he was comfortable letting others draw their own conclusions about how he had managed to survive the day's events. As he locked up his shop that evening, Marcus realized that the incident had changed something fundamental about his relationship with civilian life. He would never again be able to completely forget the soldier he had been, but perhaps that wasn't entirely a bad thing. The skills that had once kept him alive in foreign wars had now protected him, and potentially others in his own neighborhood. The walk home felt different than it had that morning, with Marcus automatically noting potential threats and escape routes in a way he hadn't done for years. But rather than feeling paranoid or hypervigilant, he experienced a sense of competence and readiness that he had almost forgotten he possessed. The peaceful civilian and the combat veteran were finally integrated into a single identity. The next morning, Marcus arrived at his shop to find a small crowd of customers waiting for him to open, drawn not by morbid curiosity about the robbery, but by genuine concern for his well-being and appreciation for his services. Mrs. Chen from down the street had brought flowers, while several regular customers wanted to discuss security improvements for the entire block. "Are you sure you should be working today?" asked Tom, whose smartphone Marcus had been repairing when the robbers arrived. "Nobody would blame you for taking some time off after what happened." The genuine concern in his voice reminded Marcus why he had chosen this neighborhood for his business in the first place. "I'm fine," Marcus replied, unlocking his door and flipping on the lights that illuminated his workspace. "It'll take more than a couple of drug addicts with a cheap gun to run me out of business." As he said the words, he realized they were completely true. He had survived much worse than yesterday's incident and emerged stronger rather than broken. The bullet hole in his ceiling would remain unrepaired for several weeks, serving as a conversation starter with customers who hadn't heard about the robbery. Marcus found himself comfortable discussing the incident in general terms, though he never went into detail about the violence itself or the military training that had saved his life. 3 months later, the two robbers were sentenced to lengthy prison terms that reflected both their attempted crimes and their extensive criminal histories. Marcus attended the sentencing hearing, where he saw both men in orange jumpsuits looking considerably less threatening than they had in his shop. The shorter one avoided eye contact completely, while his partner nodded respectfully when their eyes met, perhaps acknowledging the restraint Marcus had shown in not killing them when he easily could have. Marcus returned to his shop after the hearing with a sense of closure, finally able to put the incident completely behind him. The soldier and the shopkeeper had found their balance, creating a life that honored both aspects of his identity while serving the community he had chosen to call home.